event will be handled by Ms. Divya, who's the director of event teach at MIT Club. And a brief introduction before I hand over. She will be chairing the session in which Dr. Virmani will be speaking. Divya is a seasoned global business development professional and has led negotiations across the geographies, USA, Europe, and India. And at present, she leads partnerships at ThoughtWorks. She opened the US market for a Turkish startup by pitching to retail leaders. And as a member of the Uber business team, I'm sure it's a dream assignment. She led partnerships. She negotiated with leadership, C-level executives of India's top technology companies, manufacturing companies, financial institutions, media houses, and policymakers. She had managed distributed technology teams at American Express and was part of the inaugural batch. This is something I think we all need to be proud of. She was part of the inaugural batch of women's officers at the Indian Air Force, and she was the fighter controller as way back in '97, and that's I think the first batch when they had when the Indian Air Force had the fighter controllers, and she was in that batch, the women team. She led Scale Up Studio and helped international startups expand to India and vice versa. And as we know, she's an alum of the MIT Sloan School. So she, in that capacity, she's the director of event outreach at the MIT Club in Delhi. With this, Madam Divya, I'll hand over the proceedings to you, and we request you to kindly proceed with the event today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Charan Singh. I'm very happy to welcome all here. One request, everyone, please mute. And before anything else, I'll start with a little bit of hygiene issues. Please keep yourself muted. And all the questions should come via chat. I think still someone needs to mute because I can hear some of the background noise. It will be great. Yeah, now it is perfect. All the questions, please keep posting them via chat and we'll take them up one by one. Your questions are very, very welcome. And now we get started. Welcome all to this lovely evening. We are going to have a very scintillating discussion. Very excited to have Dr. Virmani here. And he's a very, very illustrious person. He's now the president of Forum for Strategic Initiative. And also of Chintan. He's the chairman of EGROW, the Foundation for Economic Growth and Welfare. He has served as a member of Technical Advisory Committee of RBI on monetary policy, and also as mentor of public policy to FICCI during 2015-16 and 16 and 17. He was the executive director at International Monetary Fund, and he has represented as India as ambassador to IMF, also Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and Bhutan. He has been an advisor to Indian government at highest levels for 25 years. And he has served as chief economic advisor to Ministry of Finance and principal advisor to the Planning Commission. And during his tenure, he has written numerous notes, papers, influenced public policies. He has been associated and influenced as a leader various bodies such as TRI, SEBI, and has been in board of trustees of very, very known names such as SBI, UTI, and the works. There are many, many things that are in this very influential resume, but better than everything is we get to hear from him about economic reforms today. Not only the economic reforms today, the progression of economic reforms in India. This is an encapsulation of MIT folks. It's like all the economics classes rolled into one about India. So very excited. Welcome, Dr. Virmani, and I hand over to you.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Am I on? I can't make out. Hello? Yeah. Okay, so let's start straight away. Thanks, Divya. I just want to mention one thing. I was very impressed. I heard her talk on her experiences in the Air Force, and that was fascinating. But anyway, today it's about reform, so let's start with that. Uh, uh, what I'm going to do is very, very briefly provide a background of the nature and history of India's market reforms. And say a little bit about the goals. The goal is basically acceleration of GDP growth, and indirectly the revenues and tax revenues, non-tax revenues, and certain aspects of the welfare programs. Efficiency of government expenditure, because given the limited resources, maximizing the social welfare gains through government expenditures is very important. So that's broadly the goal of the reforms, so to say, with the primary objective of GDP growth. How has this evolved? Very briefly, I will give you a sense of that. But part of the problem starts that we from 2004 onwards, we needed policies for sustaining fast growth. But what actually happened was a shift from economic objectives, which I've kind of outlined above, to more social goals. So GDP growth actually slowed. And of course, with the arrival of the pandemic this year, growth has collapsed. And finally, we'll get into what, for want of a better word, we could call Modi 2, which is the second term of the Modi government, starting around May of 2019, where the goal actually is coming back because of this growth collapse, slowdown and collapse, which we've seen before that. We've kind of returned to the original goal, which was accelerating growth again. And here the policy reforms are in process and pending, we'll go over, which are absolutely essential. Very briefly, we had a kind of socialist-oriented policy frame from 1950 to 79, where the basic thing is that assumption that government knows best. Of course, the USSR was the propagator of this, China indirectly, in India in our own adapted way, that private sector is exploitative and you have to therefore control and direct it. And the result was that we created a whole bunch of unnatural monopolies. The policies followed basically created, which were not even there before, unnatural monopolies. So that's very, in simplistically, I would say, what the socialist approach was. And the market economics was introduced in 1980 onwards, with actually the second return of Indira Gandhi 2, as I sometimes call it, where the basic kind of, again, very simplistically and simply, these are the basic elements, that competition is the key to productivity. And of course, I won't explain these in detail, but in all the policies you will hear, these are kind of the underlying basic principles which I apply in my market reforms. Public goods you have to watch out for. The common ones are roads, communicable diseases, macroeconomic framework, pollution. This is just to give you an idea of the public goods. Externalities are very important. You have to deal with them. Optimal subsidies, benchmark competition, these are the kind of things which come up when we are dealing with externalities in infrastructure. And third thing, which is very important, is information asymmetries, which kind of tell us how a modern regulation has to be in financial sector, in education, health, and now, very importantly, still in the process of getting it understood and putting it right, is the whole digital economy. Sorry. Yeah. Okay. So now we get into the substantive parts of it. Reform for income growth. The initial reforms, as I suggested, started the market reforms in 1980s with selective decontrol and a focus on decontrol of external trade. Now, the amazing thing, and this is something I've studied very carefully, but it's history, so we will not spend much time on it. unless there are questions. And the amazing thing about this is that the per capita GDP growth, which is how we generally measure the performance of the economy when we are talking about reforms and growth and welfare, particularly, tripled percent per year to 3.9%. That's an incredible rise, and I have written on that and so on, but we'll leave it at that for the time. Many people know this reform actually took place, that there was any such thing. But this number which I'm giving cannot be known, because it is just, it's like a tripling of the rate of growth. And so 90s reforms in terms of actual were much bigger. Price production capacity, element, investment, allowing capital markets, foreign banking and financial sector, trade, one of the most extensive, exchange rate, etc. There were a whole slew of reforms, which is why they caught the attention of world economists and so on. And say, so the world actually thinks that this was the only reform which actually happened in India. But the results you would see was an acceleration of per capita GDP growth by 50%, which compares with the 300% or a tripling earlier. Not to be sneezed as, you can think of that the closer you get, the faster and faster you grow, the more difficult it becomes to accelerate the growth. So reforms for sustaining growth. I just recall that around 2000 we had accelerated this growth to 5.5% in per capita income terms, and it was becoming important to sustain the growth. So what? Sorry, this is before. This is the last element, right? So we had accelerated in the 90s, and then from 99 to 2003-4, some of the areas needed for sustaining growth were coming up. So these were the areas. Infrastructure was the main focus in this period, which I've given there, 99, 2000 to 2003-4. And the basic idea was to introduce private competition into areas which were basically government monopolies. So there was a new telecom policy, a very important reform. Public goods focus, National Highway Authority was activated, road rates were set up, very important public good. Electricity Act, kind of an almost revolutionary Electricity Act was passed. And then there was some movement on private entry into private ports and airports. So a big focus on reforms in the infrastructure sector, which were essential for sustaining growth. And then the first kind of central public sector undertaking privatization policy was initiated, and it met with huge resistance. So after one hotel was privatized, it all kind of came to a grinding halt. So you see here the effect on growth was about, in per capita income terms again, was even less, so to say. So the closer and closer you get to a high growth level, the harder in some sense it becomes, and more important to kind of sustain growth. So you can see that the issue of acceleration is going down, and you're really getting into the issue more and more of sustaining growth. That's the point of this whole, what I've just said. So when we come to the next period, 2004 to 13, roughly period of 4-5 to 13-15, the important issue, as I said, was that sustaining growth at this high level of over 6% per year became very important. But the actual evolution of the policy was the opposite, that we started giving primacy to social goals instead of sustaining growth. And though there were, it's not to say that nothing was done. There were some institutional reforms like FRBM and UI, which later on were built upon. But the basic approach shifted. So, oh, sorry, there was a question on top which in changing the headings, I removed it. So anyway, so the question was, were there reform? Well, that's on the heading, yes. So the answer was no during this period. And then during the 14, 15, 19 period, there was an initial effort towards this in this direction, but then it soon petered out. So it was just for a year or so, and then it went back to being no. Okay, so now we come to the current period, which is the main focus of this talk. So that part is kind of background for the main elements of talk. So what happened? There were mixed goals. There was a larger focus on institutions. Remember what I said earlier? Even in the previous 10 years, from roughly 2004, 5 to 13, 14, there was some institutional reform. Same kind of thing, but the primacy of social and moral goals kind of remained. You know, that the earlier focus on accelerating and sustaining growth kind of took backseat. So we had these big focus on anti-corruption laws, demonetization. I would put in that same category of kind of social moral orientation and institutional reform. These were basically negative for sustaining fast growth. These are not things which would have a positive effect on growth and were more likely to have a negative effect. Even the institutional reforms which were done, Monetary Policy Committee, IBC, the India Bankruptcy Code, GST, all these were great institutional reforms, but they had short-term negative effects. So it's something I call the J curve of institutional reform, which there's a whole paper, and again, I won't talk about it. But the point here is that these two things taken together, you actually, instead of accelerating growth, you had a kind of opposite effect of these reforms, which led to a slowing down of a growth, and as we know, it went down to 4.2% last year. So back to the issue of policy reform for sustaining fast growth, we didn't have them so for 15 years. That's the immediate background. For 15 years, there were little or no reforms which were effectively acting to sustain fast growth, where we had attained something like over 6% per capita income growth at one point. And so pending since 2004, this is not something which I'm saying in hindsight. In 2009, which was my last year as CA, I won publicly, and I wrote a paper for OECD. We were living along with another colleague of mine, where we warned about this issue, that we needed reform for sustaining growth, otherwise the growth would slow. This accelerated growth is not a God-given. It doesn't sustain itself, and subsequently, I also did a paper while I was at IMF as executive director, where I did a review and gave a whole detailed explanation of why this was true and what are the things which had to be focused on. And here we can just mention these were some of the things which mentioned sectors like agriculture, oil, mineral, education, public sector, defense, and factor market, labor, land, capital, finance, corporate management, where the cost of these factors was much higher than internationally. So at some point, it was inevitable that these will start becoming a constraint on maintaining growth. That is where the sustaining growth issue comes in. You're growing, but then other new and more things, for example, infrastructure becomes a constraint, and then other things like this. Okay. So what are the issues? What were the issues as of, let's say, the end of last year, which kind of were there for 15 years, but were not addressed? So one was the structural transformation of the economy. Agricultural productivity for something like 50 years was stuck at 50% of the global average. It's actually amazing. It's not 50% of the best practice, but global average. Okay? And the result of that was that you had something like 2/3 of your labor force dependent on agriculture, even though non-farm employment had grown to about more than half of total income of the rural areas. But still, the GDP from agriculture was down to less than 20%, but the people directly engaged in agriculture were still around 60%. So this structural transformation, there's no other country that I know of had at this level of income had such a distorted structure of production, where so much of employment is stuck in the rural agricultural areas. No other country that one can think of. There may be some obscure small country which one has not heard of. So it was a major structural problem in the economy which needed to be addressed. But then there were these cost and quality factors. Land, labor, capital, and corporate market for these, the costs were too high. Recent estimates done by certain other private consultancy organizations suggest that all these are, the cost in India is 20 to 25% higher than in our competitor countries, where generally we think of competitors as Southeast Asia and China. Education and skills, everybody knows about it, but the pathetic quality, we've had a public education system, government education system, right from the beginning of the independence. But as you may have heard, the results show that 50% of children at age of 13 can't read at the 6th or 7th grade level. So really you had an education system which doesn't really teach. So that's a fundamental, and this problem of credentials over the last, for that 10-year period which I mentioned, there was a big increase in school and college education entry, but many of these credentials are completely hollow. We have reports from employment agencies where they interview these people, and somebody with an MA in masters formally, really can't even carry out an elementary discussion, on not technical issues, but just asking, okay, you went to your cafe, how many times did you go there? Were there, what was served in the cafe or something, in your school cafe? I mean, things like that, they can't discuss. So infrastructure, power, again, the cost issue is there, and of course, logistics and transport, which keeps coming up when we do comparisons. So actually, it's not as bad as the comparisons international often suggest. But anyway, so intermediate goods, import tariffs, domestic, the simplicity of GST, etc. All these raise the cost when we compare with the foreign companies when we're talking about competing in export markets or in import. And then, of course, the policy-created monopolies, which I've already mentioned earlier, and the public sectors as a resource drain. Public sector was supposed to contribute positively to social welfare. What it does is it drains resources, huge amounts of losses. Whenever there have been, we have comparative picture of public sector and private sector operating under the same conditions, the profitability and value of public sector is up to 30% less than the private sector. So very clearly, the public sector as a resource drain, we need to change that. So that is reform for sustaining growth. Needed to do these things. And of course, government efficiency, corruption, tax efficiency, etc. All those things we will also mention, but these were the issues. So reforms in Modi 1, just very briefly. Let's see how are we doing on time? Okay, not bad. So reforms in Modi 1 were Indian Bankruptcy Code I mentioned. This was a major reform which we had been talking about, both from the perspective of management competition, which I mentioned, and in terms of bad debt. A whole corporate policy was implemented in 2013-14, and bankruptcy code should have been an essential part of it, but they couldn't do it, the previous government. So this was definitely a major reform. Monetary Policy Committee, again, people have been talking about independence of monetary policy for ages and ages. It was a major reform, but there were major flaws. Again, that paper on J curve, which I mentioned, tells you what the actual result was, how the J curve something which would have been a positive became actually a negative for growth in the short term. Hopefully, in the medium long term, it will still become that. And same with goods and services tax. Major reform of the constitution, which could have been a tremendous positive right from year one, but initially it became a negative factor. So these are illustrations of what I call the J curve, which is, just think of it as this, that if you have major reforms, and there's also a paper on J curve of policy reforms in the IMF working papers, and this is the J curve of institutional reform. But if you have major reforms, then generally there is a short-term loss of the rate of growth of productivity, and then it takes off and productivity takes off. In the policy case, I actually showed with empirical estimates how this happened. In this paper, there's just a discussion of this factor, because it's very recent. We don't have data on productivity. So natural resources, unreformed oil, coal, mineral spectrum on every, all of these, the sale through auctions, which again, something which I had been talking to with ministers level at many times in the past, finally actually happened. Because we know this is the only way things like natural resources, you can determine their price and give it out in a competitive way. We need a well-designed auctions. Not that the auctions were perfect, but at least the concept of auctions was completely uniformly accepted and adopted. The DBT, with the Aadhaar, we mentioned UID was started in earlier, but it was really adopted, implemented as Aadhaar, Jandan, etc., and the DBT for farmers. These are, of course, good reforms, institutional reforms, and Digital India, the e-governance market, e-governance, BharatNet, etc. All these, but partial, incomplete. The corporate tax reform for 5 years, we were trying to reform during this period. And then, of course, what I've already mentioned, the institutional problem, the social, moral orientation kind of overwhelmed all these. Even in principle, they have a J curve. They take time for the positive. These other ones below take time for the positive effects to appear, but it was all overwhelmed by this moral focus or a social focus, which overwhelmed on the growth. And so you had a reduction in growth. Now, my basic thesis, which I've been propagating, my friend Suman Berry mentioned on Twitter and elsewhere, so I'm glad I got this chance to put it on in a presentation, is that things have changed in Modi too, quite dramatically. And that is what I want to illustrate in the remaining time I have. So the first, I think there is now a clear recognition in this government that government monopolies need to, whatever remaining government monopolies are there, we need private competition for the reason I outlined, that government monopolies are actually destroying value, not creating value. Oh, sorry. Something got mixed up in the presentation. Okay. So the first one actually, the numbering got messed up. I'm still new to this. So first, most important, the corporate income tax reform. We knew, of course, that 25% from international, 25% rate is the revenue maximizing rate. So this supply chain incentive, which reduced temporarily for manufacturing in the next 3 to 5 years to 15%, was really very surprising and kind of shows a change in the mindset, fundamental change from the Modi 1 period. From that social moral focus to reviving, re-accelerating growth, I call it. So the message has gone. I think people keep saying, oh, the government is not listening, that it is not understanding, growth has gone down. I think they are completely wrong, and I hope in the remaining 10, 15 minutes I have, you will understand that this has completely changed. That's the big message I want to give. The second part is the government monopolies. I think now there's a clear recognition so that systematically, wherever government monopolies remain, they are being private competition is being introduced. Coal has taken a long time, but finally we have commercial coal mining, oil in terms of giving oil prospects, etc. Defense, major shift. Of course, it doesn't happen overnight, but now the recognition is 100% clear, and that was made clear by that 75% FDI automatic approval route which was put up. It's a signal. It's a signal of the mindset. This is what people, again, were nitpicking. You can always nitpick, this has happened, this is what happened. But what I'm talking about is a major change in approach. Okay, space, atomic energy. Again, two things I did not expect so quickly. I mean, I would have thought maybe 5-10 years later this will happen, but it happened. Okay, at one go. So major change in approach on this. So 1, 2, 3, the strategic industry policy framework. The government has said it is going to be. Why is this important? Are these just words? No, because this will lay down the framework for privatization of CPSEs and PSBs for the next decade. It's not a question of whether we've done privatization last year or how much we will get done this year, which is a pandemic year, which is clearly nothing may happen. But that framework is very, very important, because this is the third factor which determines this change in approach to an approach which some of us, myself, of course, have been recommending for, I don't know, 3 decades or more, and many of my, several of my friends who have been discussing it. So it's a major change in the mental framework of economic policy. Education policy. Less important, it seems, right now, but again, there is something we have been talked about, written about. When the Make in India policy came, I wrote a little blog on Educate in India, where we said that you have to have a proper regulatory framework for private and foreign entry. And this education policy, as far as I've read, I've not read the whole detail, tries to do that. It's not perfect. I'm sure there are other things which are missing, but it actually tries to do that. The fifth one, agriculture. I called it revolutionary reforms. Remember my first structural problem, which again I wrote about, I don't know, it's a planning commission paper. It's hopefully still on their website somewhere with Niti Aayog. I don't know if they junked all those old papers. But this is something which is there in that paper where I talked about the structural problem and the reform. This is the first effort to change this 50-year-old problem. But of course, the problem had become more acute in recent years because the wheat rice economy is at a complete dead end. The current policy, which just supports the wheat rice economy, has resulted in rising levels of food grains in storage. They are totally useless. They just rot there. We keep accumulating rice, wheat. The stocks are at the highest level ever. And they are something like 2 to 3 times. You know, in my earlier days, I don't know, 20 years ago, there used to be a technical advisory, technical committee which used to decide what is the optimal level of food reserves. And as far as I know, the last committee was set up, I was the member. No committee has been set up on that issue since then. And they've just kept increasing the returns. So it was a disaster, the whole agriculture. And the reform of the Essential Commodities Act, the Farmers Produce Trade and Commerce Act, etc., for the first time introduced competition into the agricultural sector, the demand side, and will have revolutionary consequences eventually. The question again is not that this is perfect and everything is done, but this was the absolute essential for solving that structural problem which I mentioned. Labor codes, 44 labor codes to 4. We've been waiting on this. Even this government had talked about this at the beginning of the first term, and before that, the Vajpayee government had talked about it. But it's finally happened. It's happened now. So all these 6 things which I've pointed out, from 44 to 4 labor codes, and we can go into the details of the labor codes, but from whatever I have been able to read and hear about it, it actually does what many of us have been recommending for decades and decades. The Electricity Amendment Bill is also important because the Electricity Act 2003, which was done in Vajpayee's time, actually was a revolutionary change, but the distribution part just couldn't be sorted out. Again, to mention a personal thing to say, I'm not talking academically, but we tried, many committees tried to introduce competition into distribution. The competition in production and transmission has happened, okay? But what has not happened is distribution. And again, I think I was chairman of the last committee which tried to do this in the Planning Commission. I chaired a committee which was trying to get, because states are involved, distribution is under the states. So it's very hard. But this is finally making another. So what is the problem? The problem is that the Indian industry, there's a cross-tax subsidy. So inside the system, instead of explicitly, all state governments ask industry to pay 30%, 20 to 30% higher rates to subsidize consumers and other sectors, agriculture and consumption. So what that means is that industry is not competitive. Any industry which needs electricity, and particularly where it's tradable goods which have to compete with the world, you have a 20% disadvantage straight away. So, okay, so this is the, I would say, leaving aside the last, which actually I don't expect there to be a quick resolution, but if distribution could actually have competition, these 7 reforms to me constitute a near Big Bang, or actually a Big Bang reform. What we used to call Big Bang reform, and that's the main message. That these are. We will discuss the impact towards the end. So what else is left? I think there are still 4 or 5 things which can easily be done, or at least half of those can easily be done by the end of this year, financial year. So one is GST simplification. We have given a major paper on the EGROW have done on showing exactly how complicated GST still is and how to reform it. The second one is the direct tax code. In 2009, one of the last acts in government as CA before I retired was to approve a model direct tax code. We had a presentation, approve it, meaning technically from as CA with minor suggestions. We actually, and I have a copy of it, which it's lying over there, but I still I have a copy of that code. So, and then government has had a committee last 2 years ago, etc. It doesn't require anything. It just requires action in the next budget. GST is a little more complicated because the GST Council is responsible, not the central government. But the first step would be the central government adopting some rationalization approach and persuading the GST Council. I think both these are doable by March 21. The third one is a little more, we already have the basic DBT system, but I think the time has come to move over to a direct cash transfer system, which incorporates many more, or if possible, all subsidies which go to individuals should be incorporated into this. Which are paid or particularly individual, but possibly even industry. For example, fertilizer subsidy, instead of going through industry, should go directly to the farmers. And that's doable now. And why is this mentioned now? Because it's very, very important in the pandemic. Because we wouldn't have the complications of droves of people on the roads and not having foods, the so-called migrants, if we had put this direct cash transfer system in place. So by its very nature, it can put money in the hands of people wherever they are, whether they are working in urban areas, whether their wife is in the rural area, or they're traveling in between, or they're living half the year in one, half the year in the other, and so on. It is just such a flexible system, a DCT, a mobile cash-based, mobile wallet-based DCT system. Skills, I just mentioned these for completement because it's a small thing which gets but Apprenticeship Act, because modern skills are not acquired just by education. We mentioned education, you need the education, but you need to, learning by doing is very, very important. And here you need to modify the Apprenticeship Act to make it easy. Don't look at all industry as exploiters. There are lots of industries which have to train people, and they cannot do it. They don't have the resources if you insist that they give minimum wages and everything else while actually training people, where they are giving something to the trainee, not just taking. The guys are not doing anything productive, they are being trained. So, and so on, the e-skilling platform, etc. The skills area, I think, needs a lot more intelligent thought and action. And then external trade, I just mentioned textiles, agriculture. There's still pending reform, which we haven't reformed since 2002, which needs to be done, which is very easy to do. There's not much opposition except bureaucrats, and that can easily be overcome if somebody just does it. But the more important point that what I call a dualistic trade policy, which I think is needed, where the tariffs, PMP, PLI, SCRI, I don't know if these words mean anything to you. There is a product-linked incentive scheme. There is a supply chain resiliency initiative in which Japan and Australia are involved. I think all these need to be put together in what I call a dualistic trade policy, where only in countries which have unfair trade practices, and we know who these countries are, there's one big country, and against everybody else, it should be the standard free trade policy. And I want, and many of my friends who are free traders, this message is always for them. I'm completely in favor of free trade, conventional free trade policy for the rest of the world. But for certain countries who we know of and need not be mentioned, we need a more directed industrial trade policy of the kind which I think is being put into place. And EODB, we know that 40% of regulations and problems are at state level, but the center can take the initiative in SEZs and union territories by putting in a model regulatory system for decriminalize, reduce the number of regulatory compliances, digitize, and use post-file audit instead of this inspector Raj. So this is a different approach of replacing inspector Raj by this kind of thing. Now, as I said, the center cannot do it in every state. It's not possible. So what the center can do is implement this in SEZs particularly, and hopefully also in UTs as a model for others to follow. Again, this is slow. This will not have immediate benefits, but has an enormous impact on this mindset issue, which I emphasized in the 6 reforms. And on that, I would also put this GST, DTC, and I think to some extent the cash transfer. It will have a big effect in terms of giving the reform message. And finally, the states, I just want to put on record, but because people keep talking about land costs, and much of that is a state level issue. It has to do with land use regulations, titling, how the transfer system works, etc. But just for the record. Okay, so last 2 slides. We are at 50. Okay, we are almost finished with 50. Okay, let me hurry. So I'm going to go through. I'm not going to take time. Just mention them and like a fast rail. So the big negative is, of course, world GDP growth is, because of the pandemic, is going to be much slower than it was in earlier periods. Remember when I said we accelerated from 1.9 to 3.9% and then 50% more, especially in the latter period, the thing was much more favorable. It's going to be unfavorable now. So that is a big negative, but they're also positive. Deglobalization is a negative for world trade, FDI, etc. But we've actually done reasonably well through this period. Even critics of the government have now written that India's share has not gone down, it's gone up in both in trade, FDI, etc. And similarly, movement of people is going to be much harder. We've all heard of H-1B visas and all that, but I think there is a positive side to it, remote working. I think we are going to benefit hugely. Even if H-1B goes up, this new trend or accelerated trend for remote working. So instead of needing H-1B, we can supply these services directly sitting at home in India. High-tech decoupling, value chains. We are well placed there. Export supply chain diversification from China. Digitization, India was slow. Now it's going to accelerate rapidly. And I think we are, again, I've already heard of many companies which are taking advantage of this, especially in the social sectors, e-learning, education, skilling, health, etc. So that's a great trend, which we can turn to positive environment, positive advantage. Environment, we are already initiated International Solar Alliance. Again, we've developed our solar panel industry for the last 10, 15 years, and we are all set for other things. So, and finally, of course, public health and nutrition. Again, we've laid the basis. We are competitive in pharma and drugs, and this API vaccine issues, we are well placed. Sewage sanitation and hygiene. The Swachh Bharat campaign is already there. It needs to be expanded to modernizing the sewage and other systems. So all these new trends or accelerated trends are positive for us, which we can take advantage of. So what is the conclusion? Indian economy has been set back by a series of events. The GDP growth last year was 4.2%, Q4 was 3.1%. Now, if you convert this is GDP, if you convert this as per capita GDP, we are kind of almost back to where we started, not the 1.9. Remember, I told you accelerated from in the 80s. So we are, and then of course we got hit by the pandemic, where my forecast is for -5% for this current year, plus minus 2.5%, really with a downward bias. So, I mean, if I were to translate in clear words, my projection is the highest I have seen, which is about -7.5%, let's say, for this full year. The one which comes closest to my forecast is, I think, a -8% prediction by Citibank or some other forecaster but that's the closest, -8. So if I'm right, I will be it's the highest prediction of what will happen. Maybe right, maybe not. But the problem now, of course, is that we are having got down so low, we are now back to the problem of re-accelerating growth. So in some sense, the only way out was big bang reforms during the pandemic. And I think starting with that corporate income tax reform, I think it was July or August, I don't remember the exact date, before the pandemic. But the 5, 6 other reforms which I mentioned, which have been done since then, have set the stage for past pandemic growth acceleration, the re-acceleration of growth. But given all the uncertainties, the difficulties, I think we can't rest and just say these 7 are enough. I don't think they are enough, given all these dangers abroad, etc., and the delays some of them will have in affecting. So to minimize the risk from slower world GDP growth in the short term and medium long term, and maximize geo-economic opportunity, my recommendation is that we complete those so-called pending reforms. And as I said, every single thing, for example, EODB can't be done in one day, but some of the things, as I pointed to you, that 3, 4 or 5 of those things can actually are realistic. It is not an unrealistic recommendation. So if these are done, I am reasonably confident that we can re-accelerate growth from the next year itself, not wait another year or 2 years or 3 years. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Birmani. This was very, very interesting. It was a total roadmap. We could see where we started, where we could go potentially, and what can be the best for us. Before we start collecting questions, we have 2 already, and as you all know, that I have to be physically chained to stop asking questions. I would let Suman Berry do a quick commentary on this. Suman, all yours.
Divya, thank you, and apologies for my appearance because I'm dressed in a tracksuit. Arvind, it certainly, all that one had hoped for, which is an integrated, coherent framework. Can I just pick up for the non-specialists on the call the main points that struck me, which are partly commentary, partly challenges? Okay, I promise Divya to keep it to 3 minutes.
Okay.
I guess really one thing that comes out is that is an argument by you that while the branding of reform by UPA has been much more effective, including the most recent books by the Aluwalias, that there's an equivalent story for on the NDA front, starting from the Vajpayee years and continuing into the Modi years. And my question to you is, what is your assessment about why uh, you NDA finds it so hard to communicate and articulate what they're up to? Okay, why are they so shy of frameworks? We understood earlier that basically 1990, well, you talked about the 1980s. 1980s was really about cleaning up taxation. 1990s was basically saying that integrating with the world is going to help India, not harm India. I don't think I'm the only person who sees what you have said and what is coming out of government as just a series of random events. And so, what would you commend to this government as a narrative to knit all this together? Because, as Bob Schiller has said, the world depends on stories, and this government has been very poor at articulating a storyline, would be my humble submission. Okay. Now,
Okay.
secondly, um, you know, almost all of this was about what we need to do domestically. It's only towards the end that you brought uh, you know international engagement into it. Is that your sense of? So I would like, if you have the time,
Yeah.
to articulate
Yeah.
your sense of the interaction between the external and the domestic. Okay, because yes, you've talked about a neighbor to the north and all of that, but there's a sense going out with Atmanirbhar, etc., that India is turning its back on global engagement, and yet many. The most powerful factor for raising productivity in the 20 years or 30 years that you've been at the helm has been global engagement. And I think we've done a pretty good job, not only on the trade front, on the goods front, and services front, indeed, but actually on financial integration as well. We've financially integrated without a huge accident. And I think we should take credit for that. And I think, what you did in 91, 92 on the exchange rate, etc., was foundational. So, please, as it were, uh, articulate your view on, as it were, what the interaction is between the external and the domestic. And then finally, I would say that um, the running saw, frankly, of the Indian performance has been fiscal. Okay, we have not, unlike China, enjoyed the dividends, the fiscal dividends, to the extent, the tax dividends, to the extent that we might have expected. I'm a little puzzled while that's so. I do worry a little bit about also what the extent to which fiscal federalism has been stressed by the actions of this government during the pandemic. So, I do think that amongst the other reasons for Chinese success, the fact that they got their fiscal architecture right was bloody important. And I don't think we're there yet. And again, the narrative of where we're heading on the fiscal is very muddied. Divya, thank you so much for giving me this opportunity.
Thank
Okay.
you so much.
Yeah.
Yep.
So I think I'll take this question. On the narrative, I think your first and second question are somewhat related. I think, so let me start with the second one, the international. I think the difficulty is that we start, in Modi 1, the government started with Make in India. And that, given the rise in tariffs after that, in maybe 2 or 3 budgets, I don't remember exactly, you are well aware of that. It's got associated with protectionism. So they coined a new word, Atmanirbhar Bharat, local and global, etc., but that narrative has not gelled. I'm pretty clear now that that is an attempt, in fact, I've said it, I've just done a 3-part series with Didi, where a part of this is an effort to create self-confidence. Okay, so it's not just self-reliance, it's also self-confidence. So there's this careful balance between the local and regional. I don't think Modi too is against it, but there is a large constituency in BJP who never have successful reforms without taking your constituencies along. And I've seen this before in the little bit of dabbling I do on the link between economic and political, and written about it. So let's not get into the politics. So you're right to the extent that it's been a struggle to explain to the world, and given the history, it's a harder take now, because when the tariffs were raised, there was not a clear articulation of the kind I have been giving, that there is a case for raising tariffs very selectively against a particular country, or maybe 1 or 2 countries only, where you want to have a kind of import substitution policy. But at the same time, you must be very, very careful not to take these arbitrary actions against the rest of the world. And I don't think that there has been clarity of thought and analysis on that point, so that creating the narrative was difficult. So the foundation wasn't there. So I think that point is well taken. I think it requires both a little bit more work in carefully defining what I call a dualistic trade policy. And I think it's feasible and possible, and will gel with this Atmanirbhar Bharat objective and the self-confidence. Because part of the self-confidence, if I may kind of jump the example, is that is the issue of farmers' reform, right? I mean, for 70 years, farmers have been treated as if either they are stupid, or they are like children. If you give them the right information and knowledge, they will not be able to make decisions. And it's amazing, so this self-confidence, what the 3 reforms have done is to give you options. Why should that create a negative against the farmers? They are not idiots. They have an extra option. So I'm sure you don't think like that, but there are many, many people who just do not think like that. They think everybody is protected because, or whatever. Everybody else can compete, but farmers cannot. But the point here I'm making is about self-confidence, not about farmers per se, which we can discuss in the context of the reforms. So the second point, I think you're quite correct, and you're quite correct to point to the financial part reforms. Yes, I had kind of forgotten, because there were so many things in my mind. Finance, we did a lot during the 90s on the financial side too. Yes, absolutely right. And it's relatively open. Okay, let me, the third one. So first one I take as a kind of suggestion, which is a very good one. And third, the fiscal. So tax, I think the corporate income tax is there now. The GST, the problem initially was that the states had a role to get them to make the constitutional amendment and to get their onboarding. I think part of these compromises were necessary. But what they didn't realize was that you're putting one tax, but you're taking the complexity of all the taxes you have raised and putting it into GST. That kind of destroyed the simplicity which would have given you the revenue maximization and the elasticity growth. So in the paper and in presentations I've made, I've said the GST reform is kind of, let's say, approximately 60% done. But that rest of the 30-40% is critical to getting this higher elasticity, because really much of that complexity, and we've shown this in our paper, is totally unnecessary. It doesn't give you more revenues. By its complexity, it gives you less revenues. And so that is on the GST. The direct tax code, again, we have the most complex direct code in the world. Again, I've discussed this many times. Some of you may not know this, but it's a huge pothi like this. And I've actually talked to people, the MSMEs. People don't realize the direct tax code, the income tax, is not just for salaried people. We have the largest number of self-employed people in the world, the largest proportion, the largest numbers. This DTC is vital to them, to every one of them. The simpler it is, the more easy it will be to do it and to get more revenue. So the complexity of the tax system still remains bad enough for this point you have made, that we haven't got a tax dividend. Let me leave it at that. Some of the other things we can discuss later.
So thank you. First of all, Dr. Virmani, may I ask you to stop sharing your screen? It will be a better presentation.
It's still shared. I thought.
Yeah, it is still shared. Just stop sharing. There is a button. You have to stop sharing from there. And audience, I hope it's okay. We are running past the time, but it is a very interesting discussion. I will start the questions.
No, I don't think. I don't have a.
Oh, no worries. No worries. Let's proceed.
Now it is sharing. I don't know. Share content, share. I don't know. It's not showing. Stop sharing. Okay.
All right. Yes.
Okay.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Perfect. Now we can see everyone. So here are the questions. The first question is from Amit, and Amit has raised very, very important issues here, and it's encapsulated 3-4 issues that he's talking about. The first thing he says that how does these reforms enable employment? Then he talks about the income disparity. Globally, the income is getting concentrated to around lesser number of people. 1% are the richest who control the maximum wealth of the world. And then he says without income generation, economic recovery will be very difficult. And this economy lacks consumption. So what are your thoughts? Mudit has a similar thing which is added to it. So I'm taking these two questions together. Mudit says, adding to the question, are there any, why has domestic fixed capital formation dropped in last 6 to 7 years? What are your thoughts?
Okay, so there are two parts to the question. So one, the employment is of course related to GDP, and so I should have mentioned employment there, but employment is related to the growth of the economy because a lot of we have the corporate sector, but a large part of our economy is really self-employed people. So a part of that has to do with creating the conditions for startups and new companies. I think that is an excellent initiative of the government. Because historically we've thought of job creation as either government or the corporate sector, and of course third, the SMEs. So SMEs still remain important, but the startup is a new orientation. So that whole stuff which you have been reading and all, I think it's an excellent stuff, and I'm beginning to see when I watch the news of how startups are coming up. We need a model. So difference between, there are two types of self-employed. We always used to say in simple terms, ones who are forced to be self-employed because they cannot get a job, and the others who want to create or do new things where they can provide a service which is needed. So the second type really is the future, and I think we are focusing on that. And all the measures which I'm talking about in the reforms are maybe not to the same degree, but all of them are directed towards both these objectives, GDP and employment growth. Because GDP doesn't come from itself. It's a return factor. When we say GDP, just technically, arithmetically, the GDP is exactly equal to the sum of the incomes of labor, etc. So the only issue you can get technical, that's some activities will generate less and more employment. But overall, it's all these reforms are directed towards that. Now, for example, something you may not think, you may think public sector reform is not linked to it. It is, because you are wasting so many resources. They are going down the drain. They are not generating new income. They are not generating new employment. If you could use those, for example, to create infrastructure in rural areas, to educate and skill rural employees, that would generate both GDP and employment in the rural area. So everything in some sense is linked to both the economy, the GDP and the employment. Now, income disparity, yes, that's a separate issue. The one thing which is most closely linked to it, I talked about the public goods, which depends on your revenues and the efficiency of the delivery mechanisms, and even more importantly, the direct cash transfer. This used to be, and when I was at Bankruptcy, got a study done. This was like 25 years ago or something by Indian Statistical Institute, which showed that roughly the 30%, 1/3 rule, the money which government spent on welfare, is about 1/3 of that actually reached the people it was directed towards. 1/3 was lost in bureaucratic inefficiency and 1/3 in corruption. Okay, it was just diverted. It didn't reach either of these pockets. Okay, so the issue is the whole concept of direct benefit transfer and DCT is to eliminate this 2/3, the corruption part and the inefficiency part. Just imagine if instead of 1/3, you could double the amount that actually reaches the poorer people, you would solve this problem. So that's very directly linked to the issue you're raising. What is the So on the international, I would say we have homegrown solutions. One has worked on these issues. The whole idea of UID came for directing this. What I showed in a 2009 paper was that the amount of money which was spent on welfare, just the welfare program, not education, not health, just the welfare transfers, the so-called Garibi Hatao programs, was enough to eliminate poverty. Eliminate. Okay? I did a detailed calculation about the amount of money needed to eliminate, and then I showed that the 3 major welfare programs of the central government, that money was enough. If you just gave it directly to these people, it would be eliminated. So the whole, all these things are directed to doing exactly what you're asking. Now, your question on consumption investment is more short term. It is, but of course, the short term is connected with the longer term and more difficult, but let me very briefly answer it. So our analysis of the pandemic shows that the biggest, there are 3 things. Firstly, you have to think of it in 3 categories. And again, there's a research paper we have on the pandemic, which is on the EGROW website. You have to think in 3 categories of the economy or sub-aggregates. One is the essential commodities, and we have a whole list of that, how much it is. It's 40% of the economy, 55% of employment, which has not been severely affected, is more or less continue to function and is still functioning. There are minor problems, and we don't have time to get into those. The second part is this whole manufacturing, mining, construction, and I'll come back to that. And the third part, which is about 10% of the economy and 10% of employment, which is what we call contact services. These are services which are provided in the presence of lots of people. Now, in solving this last problem, there is no other solution but to get the pandemic under control. So you have to follow protocols. You have to wear masks. You have to force people to wear masks. You have to have physical distancing, hand washing, etc. if you are going to get these subsectors out of the problem. There is no fiscal measure. There's nothing else you can do. If people feel, that they will get the COVID when they participate in these activities, they will not do it. Consumption investment cannot revive. Okay. So the key issue here then is that 50% of the economy, which consists of mining, manufacturing, construction, and there we have done a detailed study, which in fact in my first talk, Charan, I think it's there, right? They can go to that talk in this series where we gave a simple explanation. Of course, there's more data now, I think couple of months of data. But what we basically showed that the biggest issue was in consumer durables, which since then has picked up. We know that automobile sector has already picked up. And secondly, on investment, which will not pick up without getting the consumption up. So the key is to drive the consumption. Plus on investment is the FDI. So again, these reforms we are doing and the signaling to show the importance of these reforms can bring in FDI much quicker than the domestic. The domestic capacity utilization is very low. So that will require a recovery of the consumption demand. But FDI and consumption sectors which are lagging, and again, as I said, the detailed analysis for August I don't have time to get into it all, but we can identify the sectors from the industry which are affected, and we have to target the fiscal incentives to those sectors. That is the way to get them back on track as soon as possible.
So thank you. I will just reiterate Mudit's question, which was the last part of it. And he has asked that why has domestic fixed capital formation dipped in last 6 to 7 years? What are your thoughts on this?
Okay, so 6 to 7 years. Yeah, okay. Right. I focused on the current and future, but this last part, right. So this explanation, okay, I've shut off the thing, but if you go back to what I said about the 10 years of the previous government and 5 years of Modi, I gave a list of policies which had the effect of undermining growth, and much in the last 5 years that has clearly affected investment. Okay, so it started actually with this retroactive tax increase, which was in the previous government, the last 5 years, and then some of these measures, anti-corruption, demonetization, etc. These measures, whether morally or socially justified or not, that's a whole different argument. I don't want to get into. But as far as the economic growth aspects were concerned and the investment aspect, they clearly had a negative growth, negative short-term effect. So it's very clear that that is the cause, what I call the J curve. And as I said, if you are interested in the details, but that's a short answer. It is that these three things is what has led to a declining domestic investment. And to revive that, we are getting these policies. So these policies are reversing that. So when I say these policies will accelerate growth, how? Clearly, in the medium long term, it will be exactly through investment. Okay? So you have to be careful in separating out the short-term problem where you need some fiscal and perhaps even credit monetary measures, and the long-term reform. In this presentation, I focused on the long-term aspects, but that doesn't mean your question is irrelevant. Yeah, there are short-term things which also have to be dealt with, and that is really the fiscal policy. And as I mentioned, if you go to our last talk, the first talk in our series, you'll find a little better appreciation of that.
Looks like there is some tech issue with me. I will have to get out of one meeting.
Okay.
Which is from.
Okay.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Am I audible?
Yeah.
Okay. So moving on to the next question. This is from Kamal sir, and he's asking, what policy changes should be made to focus on exports, as without export-led economy, we cannot achieve plus 10% annual growth in GDP. I disagree, but I want to hear your perspective.
Yeah. So let me start. The former CA, who has been a critic of the government since he left the government, has shown something which I and my friend Surjit Bhalla have been saying for the last 3-4 years, that as far as the export, our share in exports are concerned, they've actually gone up over the last 6 to 10 years. They haven't gone down. There's a wrong perception that people have had. So we've done no worse than the average of the marginally, very marginally better than the world as a whole. Clearly, there are countries, and we keep hearing about them, Vietnam, etc., which have done better, and we should definitely aspire to do better. Now, in all my and Suman was quite right to point this out. in all my studies of growth, fast-growing economies, they show that exports are important. I think I maybe a little disagree with Suman and several others who have been writing that they are a prerequisite. I don't think that is correct. That is not what my studies have shown. I think a certain level of growth is essential. So what I found was that fast-growing economies, India was able to accelerate growth quite well while being in the middle of the ranks of the fast-growth economies. I looked at, I forget the exact number, but something like 30 fast-growing economies. I studied them very carefully. And India's export growth during that fast growth period was somewhere in the middle. And we weren't even in the fastest growing economies at that time. We were in the middle of the export growth range. So what I concluded from that is that you've got to do reasonably well in export growth, but you don't have to beat everybody in the world. That is not necessary at all, okay? Because that's a particular structural or development policy. We do not have an export-led policy. I do not want India to have an export-led policy, but exports nevertheless are important, okay? So what should be done? Well, I've given you one thing. One is they're basically, we have not, since the last thing, I took leave and went to EGROW in 2002 or thereabouts. But the last thing I did before leaving that, taking a leave, was to chair a committee on tariff reform and gave some tariff recommendation. Nothing has happened for, let's see now, it's 18 years, okay? Since that committee report, which laid out the reform on custom tariff for the next 5 to 10 years, not a single thing has been done positive. On the other hand, we move backwards. So there I agree with people who are saying that one should think very carefully about it and focus tariff increase on things which are monopolized by China. Let's be very explicit. I think that's a very dangerous dependency, and India and the world must diversify. That's a given. So we have to carefully think of how to do that. Besides that, we should continue. We should have, so the second thing is we should have free trade agreements with EU and USA. We already have something like that with Japan. We don't have with EU and USA. Why is that important versus ASEAN? A lot of people keep saying ASEAN, RCEP, etc. I don't agree with that. Why? Because the supply chains which drive world growth end in EU and USA. They don't end in the RCEP countries, okay? China doesn't drive world growth. It's a net on the rest of the world. It has a surplus. When a country has a surplus for 15 years, it is depressing world growth. It is not stimulating it. This is a wrong notion we have, that China somehow, because it is such a great exporter, is driving world growth. It's not driving, okay? What drives the world growth is EU and the US. US the most, EU second, third Japan, and China maybe a little bit along with three minus, okay? So we need free trade agreement with these two countries. And third, EODB. The last EODB review where we made huge strides. One of the things where we didn't improve our EODB, the ease of doing business, was on the external trade side. Okay, and we are beginning to do that now. I just read in the paper, I have not investigated this, but last week I read that the speed of clearance of shipping cargoes has gone up tremendously. So maybe it's happening. And yes, we have to do it if we are going to be part of these supply chains and increase our export. Because you cannot do export without import. That's the nature of supply chains and value chains.
Thank you so much. And I couldn't agree more with what you have said. Now, moving on, we have a question from Anirudh. And Anirudh says, how can we leapfrog using technology on productivity? How can we increase productivity, leapfrog using the technology? What are your thoughts?
So clearly, I am a policy person. I really won't be able to get into the nature of adoption, but what I have learned over many years is, let me say a little bit about the technology first. The economics of technology shows that there are what we call externalities in R&D. that means the entire benefit. So if I or any company spends let's say 100 crores on R&D, it will not get the entire benefit of that 100. It gets dispersed among many companies. So the incentive to spend a lot of money is less. So government has an important role. These externalities, if you want the level of R&D which should happen normally in an economy, you have to plug these externalities. And this can be done if government selectively supports R&D. So when people keep saying, oh, our companies do too little R&D, that's no help to me. You by saying X, Y, Z country does more R&D, okay, so what? That really doesn't help. What helps? So first, of course, is this whole concept of EOD, right? The thing is, if it is a big chore to produce, sell your product wherever you want, people will not waste their money on R&D. You can't even do. Secondly, testing. Take the example of drugs. Drug is a huge, expensive process. You invent the drug, then you have to test it. If your rules on testing are so oppressive that nobody can test in the country, why would they spend money on inventing new drugs? You can't test them. I mean, as it is, you don't appropriate, well, you do in new pharma, but the point is that you're adding to the cost. So reform, it's again ease of doing business. The reform, the regulations, etc., have to be simplified. They must at least be equal the best practice. We are not saying give them complete freedom. Okay, we are always worried about evasion, this, that, and the other, but at least make them comparable to the best practice. The third is Incorporation Startups. We've heard about startup. There was this introduced again in that period of questions, which I mentioned to you, which I opposed. In fact, I had left by the time, but I heard about it when I was posted in Washington. That law which tax, there is nowhere else in the world is a law which that kind of taxation of startups. I've forgotten the exact detail, but that problem still has not been solved. And the problem was that people who are not startups were misusing this incentive. So instead of saying we will make it more difficult for the misusers or whatever, go and catch them, we say we modify the law to do something which is totally against economic principles. So just the example, but make them easy to operate, to start and operate. Start is just not a matter of registering, it's the whole ecosystem. So there are a number of these things which have to be pursued. And the third one is, like I said, that there are, the fourth one, is public goods. I think the government has done a tremendous job in creating these stacks. Okay, these are basically public goods. Okay, which have to be shared by others. So there's a financial stack, and so on. The technical people will know more. They don't come easily to my mind these days, but whatever. So there's a number of things connected with externalities, public goods, and encouraging the system for new companies, etc., which really will promote. Just giving lectures that you're not doing enough research, or we are doing 0.7% where China does 2%, really is not going to change that.
So thank you so much. And you talked a little about implementation as well. And this question, which is coming now, is very, very poignant, actually. And it's from a user perspective. Manjeet has something to say. And he says that while one cannot argue against the reforms over the past few years, but give us some nuance about the implementation of these reforms. As someone who has who faces GST, IT, labor laws, etc., he finds that very little thought is given to the implementation. Maybe that's why agriculture reforms are being so hated by farmers, because they have seen the other reforms and how poorly they were thought out, and how simply the implementation was little less into consideration.
Right.
What are your thoughts?
So one has to be very careful. There are kind of 2 or 3, 4 assumptions which are kind of mixed into the question. when we have a reform, market reform means less bureaucratic control on your actions. Okay, by definition, I do not call anything a reform. That some people have this assumption that any change, just because government calls it reform, is a reform. Now, that's the first mistake. That's why, if you remember, I gave you certain principles in the beginning. And that's good you asked the question, because unless those conditions are fulfilled, I do not call it a reform. The most fundamental, let me remind you, does it increase competition? If it doesn't increase competition, it is not a reform. No matter who tells you that, whether the biggest economist in the world tells you or the government tells you, it is not a reform. Okay? And so on. The public good, infrastructure, externalities, etc. Right? So that's the first thing to remember. When somebody tells you, I'm doing a reform, does it do that? The problem you'll find is half the time or more than half the time, the problem you are talking about is actually not the reform part. That's the anti-reform they've slipped in. Yes. Okay. So that's what so it's GST. Okay. GST, I worked on it for 15 years before this thing came. Some of us have been working on it, trying to design it. And again, those principles are laid out, not new, but I've laid it out again in this reform paper, which I put out. One of the essentials, which is just elementary for any economist and knows anything about tax reform or GST, is that you should have a uniform rate on all intermediate goods, because actual GST really varies, gives you more or less in a perfect situation when you vary the final goods price. So nothing is to be gained if you say one input will be 15%, another will be 10, another will be 20. Eventually, the tax you collect will depend on the final good. Okay, so if you have 100 parts going into a car, it's the final car price which will determine how much you collect in the whole chain. That's the essence of the GST, the value-added tax, what we call it. We call it here a GST. There's a reason for that, but it's a value-added tax. So why do you do these variations? Because what you did was you took everything that the states were doing and they insisted, I want this, he wants that. Everybody said, we want this. So get the consensus. They put all those things in. There's no logical advantage to those. So when somebody tells you that's a reform, what are we talking about? That part is not a reform. Okay? What is the reform is the constitutional change. Okay? And this is unique. So please don't use the example of GST, because it's the first economic related constitutional change in the 75-year history of the country. That is why it's a reform. But that doesn't mean everything else was a reform which went with it. Okay? So GST is very special. This constitutional issue doesn't arise with any other reform that I have talked about or I've talked about pending. Okay? So be careful in using the GST example. Now, second thing is, yes, you are absolutely right. Whenever something is changed, the bureaucrat is always trying to undermine it. He says, no, evasion will go up in X, Y, Z. So in that part of it, you're right. The implementation matters. Which is why I keep talking about not personal income tax reform, but a direct tax code. Okay? Because all this hera-peri in the tax reform goes into the code. If you look at the existing code, there are thousands of amendments and sub-amendments and subsections and subtexts, which is the nightmare introduced by the bureaucrats, which is why we need to take the whole thing and start afresh. Afresh doesn't mean it takes 10 years, it's there. I have the book. It gives the exact sections, etc., which we need. Okay? You don't need to work for 10 years, you need to implement it. The problem is all the vested interests which will lose are going to try and say, oh, this section needs to be complicated by X, Y, Z, otherwise there'll be huge evasion, right? So that is where you're right. You're right that when there is a change of law or rule, there is always a bureaucrat somewhere there who is trying to implement it, and you're right, that should be kept. Where you're wrong again, the third point is on the agriculture. You're absolutely wrong, because here, all that these laws are doing is give more options. No existing options is eliminated. There is no new control. It is just saying you can do certain extra things. If a state like Punjab says, I will not allow you to do state thing, they have modified their law in the state. You don't want the options. It's not imposing anything new on you. So that's the third one. The farm bill is 100% clear. There is no change. There is all new options. There is no change in the minimum support price. There's no change. You may ask, why is Punjab opposing? It's very simple. Because this monopoly over the mandis made them extract crores from the center. 3,500 crores of it went to the state government. 1,05,000 went to their artiyas and the politicians, because all the new artiyas are family members, because it's free money. There's nothing you have to do. You have to put your name when the rice goes through the mandis. Okay? Obviously, they'll oppose it. There's nothing strange about it. Okay? It has nothing to do with minimum support price or anything. It just has to do with money, as far as Punjab and Haryana are concerned. Okay? But when we are talking reforms, we are not saying that, we are talking about the people, right? Everybody, or every politician says, oh, this is good for farmers. This is good for the people. Well, I am talking about the people. I'm not talking about the politicians. They will lose. No doubt about it. Now, if that's your concern, there's nothing further to say. And finally, yes, as a general point, you're right. Many things, as they say, cup and lip. So on the code, on the labor code, absolutely 100% correct. The rules have to be notified. So the rules relating to the law is clear, the code is clear. You have to make sure that the rules are consistent with the code. And the government has said that we are going to try and make sure this is all ready by 31st March. Yes, you should watch out. All those who are concerned with the labor code should study. I am not an expert on labor code, but yes, you're right. If you're concerned with labor code, you must study those carefully when the rules come out. That happens. So there you're right.
So thank you. We have two more questions. So let me first take Nisha's question. And Nisha, thank you for joining from across the world and in this unearthly hour. Thanks for that. And her question is that, thanks, you mentioned courts, and ultimately all the reforms end up being fought in the courts. Could you please talk about potential judicial reforms today? Because today judicial system is becoming a roadblock due to delays. What do you think?
Excellent question. So, so what is it? So let me start with this.
Can I just add one more part of it? She has part 2 of this question. She says, could you please comment on telecom reforms, as some would argue that there is a reduction in competition in that field, very pertinent. And you being a founder of, very much influential at the time of TRI formation, are the right person to talk about.
Okay, so the first question, courts and legal system. So let me start with the good news, which is that the first time ever, as far as I'm aware, legal reform was mentioned in a manifesto of a political party, a national political party. The BJP has in its manifesto that they will undertake legal reforms. Okay. Now, I know some of the economists, I don't want to mention them, I'm sure they've spoken about it, who actually I encourage that you try and do, who are in the government. I'm not in the government, but I know those youngsters, and so this was consciously done by people who believe that legal reforms are important. Okay, and there is, I know there are persons in the government who believe that. Now, so that's the first thing. Now, of course, in the last 5 years or so, or 6 years, 7 years, the issue has been, which is what we thought was easy and doable, where one has also done recommendations, and my good friend Vivek Debroy, who is now advisor on the PM's Advisory Council, we have discussed and talked about this many times, was to get rid of laws which are no longer applicable. So I forget how many, but 150 or so laws which were no longer useful, etc., have been deleted from the book. So that is one element of it, but a small element. The second, more important, is reform of many other laws. We have talked about tax laws already. So there really, if you're talking about reform of laws, it has to be go through one by one, right? And the more pertinent one is the courts. Now, the problem there is that it's been tried. If I remember correctly, it was under the Vajpayee government again, under the initiative of Mr. Arun Shourie, that they tried. I forget who else was involved, but the criminal code was sought to be changed, the law of amendment, but the legal profession went on a strike. They stopped all operation in the courts, etc. So this is an issue which we need to build public opinion. And I keep, every time a heinous crime occurs, whether it's rape and murder or some other similar kidnapping and murder or whatever, I keep telling on Twitter that please, people who have influence, come together. You have to demand reform of the courts, the criminal justice system, the legal system. Otherwise, it won't happen unless public opinion is developed, because the vested interests are very, very strong. Just last week, the Delhi government has announced a 40 crore grant for insuring lawyers. Can you believe it? 40 crores for providing free insurance to lawyers. This is the Delhi government thinks is the most important welfare measure in Delhi. They are huge vested interests and they're very powerful. I have no hesitation in saying it. I'm old enough now, okay? And that's not just in Delhi, okay? So this is a very hard thing to do. The intention is there, the importance of it is there. The part which is easier to do in my view, which I think not enough focus has been given, there was a little bit. There was in one budget 3-4 years ago, provision was made for administrative, the administrative reform of the core judicial system. But I haven't seen much, the investigation of setting up labs. Just to give you one example, so there's a lot of work that can be done. Let me give you one example which a Supreme Court lawyer told me about. It's amazing. It is such a simple thing which you can do without changing all these laws. He said that if every district in the country, had 2 mobile labs where they could do a DNA test on the scene of the crime, we could get a huge increase in convictions for rape. Can you imagine if the conviction rate for rapes went up from 5% to 75%, how strong an effect that would be on potential rapists? So there are not just legal issues, but there are also very practical administrative things. He told me 1 or 2 other things like that, and one always learns. I mean, this is, by the way, that's one of the essences of reform. I used to talk to a lot of people because you just cannot know everything. So that's that. Yes, it's very important, but to do the kind of basic fundamental reform is very strong vested interest, and you have to. And judiciary itself doesn't want change, and unless the public puts pressure on it, they'll refuse to change. The whole management system of the courts could be completely digitized. We have the capability. It's not expensive. I don't know how much it would cost, but it would be hundreds of crores. You could 100% digitize the management, a modern management system of the courts, okay? And caseload and how cases are compared, etc. You could transform the system even without changing the law, okay? So there are many things like that, but there's too much vested interest and public pressure is needed, I feel. The second one, telecom. Yes, the new telecom policy, I was deeply involved in that. But I presume you're not referring to that. You're referring to the basically the problems. There are 2 sets of problems. One, of course, is this Vodafone case. Just to give you a personal story, I still remember I was sitting in the antechamber of the finance minister when Mr. Serene, who was the chairman and managing director of the US-based Vodafone, came pleading his case. And he was sitting, he came and sat down there while I was waiting. I mean, this thing is going on for 15 years, or I don't know how many years now. So a part of it is the problem which have arisen from that. The second part is something which is not widely understood, is that, in my tenure, by the way, I was also a member of TRA for a while. After participating in the new telecom policy. So auctioning is one of the things which we insisted, but it didn't happen at that time. I did, nobody else accepted it. So the thing is that this has network externalities. So the nature and meaning of competition is very new. People just automatically, who don't understand, and it requires new economics. So I don't blame any economists, but people, most economists even, and forget the other people, just assume the same things which apply to goods and services apply naturally to telecom and e-commerce, etc. That is just not true. In telecom, there's a thing called network externalities, and to explain it very simply, the more customers you have, the more you gain. So in some sense, if one company becomes very large, everybody else will be automatically wiped out. So there are rules. What we try to do, what I tried to convey when I was a member of TRAI, that the rules must be framed in such a way that this doesn't happen because of some regulatory mistake. Okay, natural thing requires a higher policy decision, but regulations must be framed carefully. For example, what does competition mean on a platform? Okay, so now all these issues are coming out, but this was there in network theory that I tried to apply. That if when you search, you first get everything Google is connected with it, that is competitive. Because once you do that, the system all naturally. They don't have to do anything more. Okay, so competition will go out. You will get a monopoly. I can predict it. So the regulations have to be framed very, very carefully. If you have a e-market platform, the bigger and bigger it gets, the less partners it needs, and they can direct you first to everything connected with that platform. Okay, so if you have the companies which Google Pay or whatever, then this has to, the regulator has to be aware of the concept. Okay, he has to know the economics of how this works, and he has to formulate regulations to ensure it doesn't happen. I mean, no, you can't ensure. I mean, it's a much bigger issue with a lot more research on, but these simple things are one learned. I mean, they were there in the literature. So what is it? It's sad. At that time, what my judgment was as the economist on the TRA, that what we need is a minimum of 3 or 4 competitors. So if we have 3 or 4 nationwide competitors in telecom, we'll be okay. We found that globally, all the small countries just had 1. But we figured that for a country of India's size, looking far into the future, 3 should be more or less enough. So I would be very sorry that if we are left with only 2 or 1 telecom provider.
Thank you so much, not only for this, but also for TRAI, because thanks to TRAI, we have one of the cheapest and most efficient services, telecom services in the world. So there is a very interesting question from Professor Subramanian. And he says that, do you feel that exchange rate mechanism needs some reform for growth vis-a-vis contrived oil pricing? What are your thoughts on it?
Thanks for the question, because that is one of my achievements. I was deeply involved in the exchange rate reforms in 91, 92. Exchange rate mechanism, I think, we've always said from then, and for a while this kind of went out, was that we begin a market determined rate, but RBI and government can and will intervene to dampen excess volatility. Now, if that is intelligently applied by regulators and the government, I think that still remains the best policy for India as far as the exchange rate per se is concerned. Oil prices is a whole different world, and I just want to say that again, I am not. I don't agree fully with many people who criticize high taxes on oil, and let me explain why. I mentioned to you earlier that the value-added tax, the key issue is the final stage taxation. And we can have a compromise between simplicity of the structure and some variation in the final good. So, for example, just to give you one example, oil, that is petrol and diesel, liquor, automobiles, and a few other items can be higher without making the system complex. So simplicity of the structure of the VAT is not inconsistent with some variation for maximizing revenue or for doing other purposes. That's the first point which you have to be clear in your mind. Now, the question is, when you want to vary this, what are the principles? And here oil comes in. Let's say we were taxing, the oil is separate in excise, but we could bring it into the VAT system and it would apply. Now, we know that oil produces externality, it produces pollution. So that is one reason that oil should actually be taxed higher. Forget the GST, okay, you can look at it the current system only, where it is an excise. So that is one argument for taxing petrol and diesel higher, because they produce an externality, they produce pollution which affects all of us. Okay, so they make the profit, we pay for it. Okay, that should not be so. We must tax them at a higher rate and use that money to help those of us who are affected by lung problems. Okay, that's the logic of economic welfare and economic efficiency. The second very important reason, which was always there, is that economic theory of taxation also tells you that the higher the elasticity, the less inefficiency is produced by taxation. Okay? So if you want an efficient tax system, there is a logic to put higher tax rates on final goods which are inelastic. And the most inelastic tool that I know of is tobacco and oil. Oil meaning the final product, not the refinery product, the oil and the diesel. So I think this automatic criticism that oil prices are too high, why are you raising excise, I do not agree with at all. Now, clearly beyond a certain point, it becomes counterproductive. And what that is what we need to focus on. And one way to do that is compare, right? If I'm not mistaken, I mean, you compare across the world. Clearly, if you're going to have a tax on petrol and diesel, which is higher than anywhere else in the world, you should think about it. But between the average for the world and the highest, there's a whole range of high rates, which I have no objection to. So that's my answer on oil.
Thank you. This is very, very important. Before we go, I have to ask a question.
Sure.
You talked about inflation targeting. What my understanding is that most of the advanced countries whose economies are doing well, their central bank has a dual mandate, whether it is US or somewhere else. And we see the example of Japan, where simply inflation targeting and not having focus on growth has somewhat taken country to a long 30-year-old recession. So do you think we are deviating from the dual mandate and focusing on inflation targeting? Is it a good way to go?
So that's an excellent economic question, actually. So here is it. About, I forget, Charan will remember, there was a committee appointed about 10, 15 years ago called the Raghuram Rajan Committee before he joined the government. And it proposed inflation targeting. In its first draft, and in my presentations, I opposed it. I said there are certain prerequisites, etc. I won't go in, and India doesn't satisfy those prerequisites. So they changed the final recommendation to flexible inflation targeting. I clearly oppose the inflation targeting. When they changed it to flexible inflation targeting, I let it go. I said, let's see what happens. So the current mandate is flexible inflation targeting, first. Secondly, in that J-curve paper, what I showed was that this introduction of flexible inflation targeting actually led to overprediction or went along with overprediction of inflation continuously, which resulted in a much, much tighter policy than even would be dictated by inflation targeting. And that is one of the major causes of what I said, the growth rate and the J curve, etc. I hinted at. I didn't give you a full picture. So, so that's the second. The third and final point to direct answer to your question, I believe actually that dual mandate is appropriate for India. The US has a Federal Reserve has a dual mandate. I think a dual mandate is a better mandate for the committee there. Yeah, but the difficulty is that the mandate is for the Federal Reserve. It is not, here we have a monetary policy committee, which is based more on the UK. So to introduce a mandate is now a difficult thing because it's not clear that you can have an MPC and a dual mandate, okay? Because MPC, at least formally, has only one mandate. And do you want to give it a mandate which will then involve all kinds of other things? Okay, it won't just be that one rate which they decide on. Okay, so it's a difficult choice at this point, but that's my general view. At this point, I think probably given all the uncertainties, I wouldn't. I think that's not a priority in my view. We maybe once we are back on a fast growth path, we need to rethink this whole issue and discuss it. But when sorry, one more point I should add. When I came back from the IMF, I was put, you mentioned the technical advisory committee. At that time, Raghu was governor. And I said at the first meeting, I said, though I opposed inflation targeting, you started it, you're going to do it. So I'll keep an open mind and let's see how it works. Okay. But as I told you, the result was because of their other mistakes, actually they tightened policy. They contributed to the collapse of growth and must take partial responsibility for it. In my view, I say that very clearly in my paper.
Thank you so much. And this is the end of the questions. And it was a absolutely superb session. And I hand over to Dr. Charan Singh. Thank you so much, Dr. Birmani. Totally enjoyed it.
I must thank MIT Club to have partnered with EGROW Foundation to host this event. As Divya Madam was mentioning, this has been a fabulous interaction and up to date on many, many things, just not the Big Bang reforms, going behind those reforms, and with Dr. Virmani's absolutely rich experience, hands-on in the policy making, the explanations and the stories that he has shared with us about TRI and the inflation targeting. I think it's really been a treat to the economist and the policymaker. The recording of this will be available in about 12 hours. It'll be on our website. I'll be happy to share the recording with Ms. Divya, and if they want, the club can use it too. I have an important announcement to make. We have started the webinar series. Dr. Virmani's talk was the first in that series. It's every Friday. I would invite you to listen to Dr. Virmani's first talk. It will enhance your knowledge and strengthen the arguments that he has made today. On November 6th, the next Friday, which is coming up, we have a panel discussion on banking issues. And in the panel, there is going to be 2 EDs from commercial banks and then the chief economist from a rating agency. I'll be sending the invite. Do watch the website of EGROW Foundation. 5:30 to 7 would be the panel discussion on banking issues, and it will be moderated and chaired by the former ED of Reserve Bank of India, Mr. V.K. Sharma. The panelists are Mr. Jani from Mr. Jani has also been a member of the National Housing Bank, very wide experience. He was the ED in IDBI. Then we have Mr. Kali, Subhash Kali. He is going to be also there. And we have Madan Sabnavis, course, be the chief economist at the rating agency. So, once again, let me thank each one of you for your participation on a Sunday evening. Thanking once again the MIT Club to partner with us and inviting you to our Friday webinar on November 6th. Thank you very much.
Thank you.